Buckle up, history lovers, because tonight we're diving into a story so dark, so twisted, it'll leave you questioning the very nature of justice. Hidden in the dusty archives of the Nevada Territory, a chilling tale from 1878 has remained buried for over a century. A tale of betrayal, vengeance, and a dinner that no one could ever forget. This is the story of Elizabeth Carver and the most shocking crime ever recorded in the desert frontier. So, grab a seat, turn down the lights, and let's unravel this gruesome mystery together. Deep in the Nevada Territory archives, buried beneath decades of dust and bureaucratic neglect, lies a sheriff's report dated September 22, 1878, that has never seen the light of day. The document describes the discovery of human remains in the root cellar of the abandoned Carver Ranch, 15 miles southwest of what would later become Reno. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the brutality of the murder, but what the investigating deputy wrote in his personal notes. The family ate him. They didn't know, but they ate him. For nearly 150 years, the descendants of those who knew the truth have kept this story buried, fearing the shame it would bring to their lineage. The autumn of 1878 brought more than just cooler winds to the sprawling cattle ranches scattered across the Nevada Territory. The Carver Ranch sat like a weathered scar against the endless desert landscape, its dilapidated buildings clustered around a main house that had seen better days. John Carver had claimed this land during the territorial rush of 1861, when the promise of cattle money drew ambitious men westward with dreams bigger than their wallets. By 1878, those dreams had curdled into something bitter and mean. The ranch employed nearly 24 men during peak season, making it one of the larger operations in the valley. John's brothers, Thomas and Robert, had followed him west in 1863, bringing their wives and children to form what John proudly called a proper family enterprise. The Carver name carried weight in the scattered settlements, from the trading posts along the Truckee River to the territorial capital in Carson City. Elizabeth had arrived as John's bride in the spring of 1867, a pale, quiet woman from Illinois, whose family had perished in a smallpox outbreak. At 20, she possessed the kind of delicate beauty that photographed well, but wilted quickly under the harsh desert sun. The marriage had been arranged through correspondence, John needing a wife to manage his household, Elizabeth needing escape from the charity of distant relatives who made no secret of their burden. The early years had held promise. Elizabeth proved capable with domestic duties, could read and write better than most frontier women, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed the neighboring ranchers' wives. John, 12 years her senior, had been attentive enough during their courtship period. The problems began when the children failed to come. By 1871, the whispers had started. In a territory where large families meant survival and prosperity, a childless wife became a liability. The Carver men began to view Elizabeth not as family, but as a failed investment. John's attitude shifted from disappointed husband to resentful taskmaster. His brothers, taking cues from John's treatment, began to regard her as little more than unpaid help. Elizabeth's daily routine evolved into a grinding cycle of cooking, cleaning, mending, and avoiding the increasingly sharp tongues and harder looks of the Carver clan. She rose before dawn to start the breakfast fires, spending her days scrubbing, washing, and preparing meals for sometimes 30 people when the seasonal workers were in residence. The ranch wives, John's sisters-in-law Mary and Sarah, had initially offered friendship, but gradually distanced themselves as John's treatment of Elizabeth grew harsher. The Nevada Territory in 1878 was still largely lawless despite territorial government efforts. The nearest sheriff resided in Carson City, over 70 miles away across dangerous desert. Most disputes were settled locally by men with guns and strong opinions about right and wrong. Women had few rights and fewer options. Divorce was nearly impossible, and a woman alone in the territory faced prospects that ranged from dire to deadly. The cattle business had been struggling. A harsh winter followed by a brutal summer drought had decimated herds across the territory. John's temper, never particularly stable, had grown explosive as financial pressures mounted. He drank more heavily, gambled at the quarterly cattle auctions, and brought home stories of neighboring ranchers who'd struck it rich while the Carver operation barely broke even. Elizabeth absorbed the blame for everything from failed pregnancies to failed harvests. If the bread burned, it was because she was useless. If the cattle prices dropped, it was because God was punishing John for his barren wife. The brothers echoed these sentiments, creating an atmosphere of constant criticism and casual cruelty that wore Elizabeth down like water on stone. The territory's isolation compounded every problem. Mail came sporadically, visitors were rare, and the closest neighbors lived 10 miles away. Elizabeth had no confidants, no allies, no escape routes. She existed in a bubble of masculine hostility. Her world narrowed to the ranch buildings and the endless cycle of thankless labor. As 1878 progressed, John's violence escalated beyond mere verbal abuse. What had begun as rough handling during arguments had progressed to outright beatings. Elizabeth learned to read the signs, the set of his shoulders when he'd been drinking, the particular way he looked at her when the ranch accounts weren't balancing, the dangerous silence that preceded his worst rages. The night of September 7, 1878, began like many others that autumn, with John returning from the saloon in nearby Virginia City, carrying the familiar combination of alcohol fumes and barely contained rage. The quarterly cattle auction had been a disaster. Prices were down nearly 40% from the previous year, and John had watched neighboring ranchers celebrate deals while his own stock attracted only lowball offers from opportunistic buyers. Elizabeth was in the kitchen cleaning the last of the supper dishes by lamplight when she heard the heavy footsteps on the porch. She didn't look up as John entered, focusing instead on the tin plate in her hands. Experience had taught her that direct eye contact during his drinking moods only provided an excuse for confrontation. "Worthless," John muttered, his voice thick with whiskey and disappointment. "Absolutely worthless." Elizabeth continued washing, her movements careful and quiet. Sometimes ignoring his initial provocations allowed the mood to pass. "You hear me talking to you?" John's voice rose, taking on the dangerous edge she'd learned to fear. "I hear you, John," Elizabeth replied quietly, still not turning around. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Elizabeth set down the plate and turned slowly. John stood swaying slightly in the doorway, his face flushed with drink and anger. Behind him, she could see Thomas and Robert settling onto the porch with their own bottles, their wives having taken the children to bed hours earlier. 10 years, John said, his words coming out in a slurred growl. 10 years I've kept you fed and housed. 10 years of nothing. No children. No luck. Nothing but a useless woman eating my food and wearing my clothes. Elizabeth said nothing. She'd learned that responses only fueled his anger. The Thompson's wife, she's got 7 children, John continued. 7. The youngest not even 2 years old. Mrs. Larson, she's carrying her 9th. John took a step closer, and Elizabeth could smell the whiskey on his breath, mixed with the tobacco and sweat that always clung to his clothes. But my wife gives me nothing but empty rooms and empty hopes. John, please, Elizabeth whispered. The men can hear. Let them hear, John roared, his hand suddenly striking out to grab Elizabeth's wrist. Let them all hear about John Carver's worthless wife. His grip was iron tight, and Elizabeth gasped as his fingers dug into her flesh. Through the open door she could see Thomas and Robert watching with the casual interest of men observing a familiar show. You cost me money, you know that? John's voice dropped to a hiss. No children means no extra hands, no sons to help with the ranch, no daughters to marry off for alliances. You're worse than useless. You're expensive. Elizabeth tried to pull away, but John's grip only tightened. John, you're hurting me. Hurting you? John laughed, a sound like broken glass. Lady, you don't know what hurt is, but maybe it's time you learned. The first blow caught Elizabeth across the face with such force that she stumbled backward, her hips striking the edge of the kitchen table. The sharp corner sent a spike of pain through her side, but before she could recover, John was on her again. This is for 10 years of disappointment, he snarled, his fist connecting with her ribs. This is for making me look like a fool in front of every rancher in the territory. Elizabeth tried to shield herself with her arms, but John was a big man, made strong by years of ranch work. Each blow landed with devastating force, driving the air from her lungs and sending waves of agony through her body. John, stop, she gasped, tasting blood in her mouth. Stop. John grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back to look into his face. His eyes held a wild gleam that terrified her more than the physical pain. I should have stopped 10 years ago. Should have left you in Illinois to rot with the rest of your worthless family. He released her hair only to backhand her across the mouth, the force of the blow splitting her lip and sending her sprawling to the floor. Elizabeth lay there gasping, her vision blurred by tears and pain, dimly aware of laughter from the porch. "Look at her, boys," John called out to his brothers. "Look at the great Elizabeth Carver now." Through the doorway, Elizabeth could see Thomas and Robert watching with amusement. Thomas raised his bottle in a mock toast. "Maybe now she'll learn her place, John." "About time someone put her in it," Robert added, his laughter echoing in the desert night. John looked down at Elizabeth with disgust. "Get up," he ordered. Elizabeth tried to rise, her movements slow and painful. Her ribs screamed with each breath, and she could feel blood trickling from her split lip. But she managed to get to her knees, then shakily to her feet. "That's better," John said with satisfaction. "Now maybe you'll remember what happens when you disappoint me." But as Elizabeth stood there, swaying and bleeding, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it, like a coal buried in ash, burned something else. Something that had been growing through 10 years of humiliation and abuse, fed by every cruel word and casual blow. John turned away, apparently satisfied with the evening's work. He headed toward the door, probably planning to rejoin his brothers for more drinking and more stories about his useless wife. He never saw Elizabeth's hand close around the handle of the carving knife that lay on the kitchen table. The blade was 8 inches of carbon steel, kept sharp for Sunday roasts and holiday preparations. It had carved countless meals for the Carver family, had been Elizabeth's constant companion through years of domestic service. Now it felt different in her grip, not like a tool, but like an answer. "John," Elizabeth called softly. He turned, probably expecting another apology or plea. Instead, he found himself face to face with a woman he no longer recognized. Elizabeth's swollen face was set in an expression of terrible calm, and the knife in her hand caught the lamplight like a promise. "Elizabeth, what the hell?" John began, but the words died in his throat as he finally understood what he was seeing. The moment stretched between them like a held breath. John's alcohol-dulled reflexes fought to process the transformation before him. This wasn't the cowering woman he'd been beating for the past 10 years. This was something else entirely. "Put that down," John said, his voice losing its earlier bluster. "Elizabeth, put that knife down right now." But Elizabeth didn't move. She stood there holding the blade, her swollen face a mask of years of accumulated rage finally finding focus. Blood from her split lip had dripped onto her apron, creating small dark stains that seemed to multiply in the flickering lamplight. 10 years, Elizabeth said quietly, her voice steady despite her injuries. 10 years of your fists, 10 years of your brother's laughter, 10 years of being told I'm worthless. Now, Elizabeth, you're upset. I understand that, but— "Do you?" Elizabeth interrupted, taking a small step forward. The knife remained steady in her grip. "Do you understand what it's like to wake up every morning knowing that the people who are supposed to care for you see you as nothing more than an object to blame for their failures?" John's eyes darted toward the door where his brothers' voices could still be heard. But something in Elizabeth's expression warned him against calling for help. This felt like a moment balanced on a knife's edge, literally, and any sudden movement might tip it toward violence. "I've been a good wife," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've cooked your meals, cleaned your house, mended your clothes, and never once complained about the life you've given me. And what have I gotten in return?" "Elizabeth, please." "What have I gotten, John?" Elizabeth's voice rose, and for the first time in 10 years, it was John who looked afraid. The sounds from the porch had grown quieter, as if Thomas and Robert sensed something changing in the atmosphere. The desert night pressed in around the ranch buildings, vast and empty, and indifferent to human suffering. John licked his lips nervously. "Look, maybe I was a little rough tonight, but you know how the business has been. The pressure—" "Your pressure," Elizabeth repeated flatly. "Your problems, your disappointments, and somehow they all become my fault, don't they?" She took another step forward, and John instinctively backed up. The cattle prices drop. It's because God is punishing you for your barren wife. The crops fail. It's because I bring bad luck. Your brothers need someone to mock. Well, Elizabeth's an easy target. That's not. I never said. You didn't have to say it, John. You showed me every day with your fists and your words and your casual cruelty. You showed me exactly what you think I'm worth. The knife caught the light again as Elizabeth adjusted her grip. John's eyes were fixed on the blade, his mind trying to calculate distances and possibilities. But years of drinking had slowed his reflexes, and Elizabeth was closer than was comfortable. "What do you want?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression John had ever seen. It was the smile of someone who had finally found clarity after years of confusion, purpose after years of aimless suffering. "I want to show you what worthless really looks like," she said. What happened next took less than 5 seconds, but those seconds would haunt the Nevada territory for generations. John, finally realizing the genuine danger he was in, lunged forward to grab the knife. But 10 years of ranch work had made Elizabeth stronger than she looked, and 10 years of abuse had given her motivation that John couldn't match. The blade found its mark with surgical precision, sliding between John's ribs and into his heart, with barely a sound. His eyes went wide with shock, then confusion, then nothing at all. He dropped to his knees, then forward onto his face, his body making a soft thud against the kitchen floor. Elizabeth stood over him for a long moment, the bloody knife still in her hand, listening to the silence that had suddenly fallen over the ranch. The voices from the porch had stopped entirely. Perhaps Thomas and Robert had heard something, or perhaps they were simply lost in their own drunken conversation. Either way, Elizabeth knew she had only minutes before someone came looking. She knelt beside John's body, her mind racing with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The fear was gone. The constant anxiety that had been her companion for so long had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly focused. John was dead, and she had killed him. In the Nevada territory of 1878, that meant she would hang if caught. But as Elizabeth looked down at her husband's lifeless form, she realized she felt no remorse, only a profound sense of completion. This was always how it was going to end. She could see that now with perfect clarity. The question was what to do next. Elizabeth moved quickly and quietly, her domestic skills serving her well in this strangest of tasks. She dragged John's body toward the root cellar entrance, using an old quilt to muffle any sounds. The cellar was cool and dark, perfect for preserving meat during the hot Nevada summers. It would serve equally well for preserving evidence. As she worked, Elizabeth's mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning and calculating with the same methodical approach she'd always brought to meal preparation. John's brothers would expect to see him in the morning. They'd ask questions if he was missing, but what if he wasn't missing? What if he was simply elsewhere? A plan began to form in Elizabeth's mind, brilliant in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. She looked at John's body, then at the large cutting block where she'd prepared countless meals for the Carver family. For the first time in 10 years, Elizabeth Carver smiled with genuine happiness. The brothers would learn what worthless really meant. They would all learn. Dawn came slowly to the Nevada territory on September 8, 1878, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and orange that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Elizabeth had not slept. She'd spent the dark hours before sunrise working with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that her life depended on attention to detail. John's body lay in the root cellar, carefully wrapped and positioned. Elizabeth had cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, mopping every trace of blood and ensuring that nothing remained to suggest violence had occurred. To any casual observer, it would appear that John had simply retired to bed after his drinking session with his brothers, but Elizabeth's work was far from finished. The most challenging part lay ahead. She began her preparations at first light, starting with the large stock pot that she normally used for cooking stews for the ranch hands. The pot was black iron, seasoned with years of use and large enough to serve 30 men. Today, it would serve a different purpose entirely. Elizabeth built up the fire in the kitchen stove, feeding it with oak logs that would burn hot and clean. The temperature needed to be perfect, hot enough for her purposes, but not so hot as to attract unwanted attention from anyone passing near the kitchen. She worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had managed a ranch kitchen for over a decade. From the root cellar, she retrieved what she needed, carrying it in manageable portions. Her domestic skills, honed by years of preparing game that John and his brothers brought back from hunting trips, served her well. She'd butchered deer, elk, and wild boar. The technique was the same, only the stakes were infinitely higher. Elizabeth worked methodically, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. She separated usable portions from waste, setting aside what could be prepared and disposing of what could not. The bone and gristle went into burlap sacks that she would later bury in the desert. The usable meat went into the preparation area she'd set up on the kitchen's main work table. By mid-morning, Thomas and Robert were stirring in their beds, no doubt nursing hangovers from the previous night's drinking. Elizabeth could hear movement from their rooms, the familiar sounds of the Carver men beginning another day. Soon they would be looking for breakfast, and they would ask about John. Elizabeth was ready for them. She had prepared a story as carefully as she'd prepared everything else. John had risen early, she would tell them, complaining of restlessness after the disappointing cattle auction. He'd announced his intention to ride into Virginia City to speak with other ranchers about pooling resources for a trip to the California markets. Such a journey would take several days, possibly longer if he decided to continue to San Francisco, to investigate Pacific shipping options. The story was plausible because it contained elements of truth. John had indeed been frustrated by the local cattle prices, and he had mentioned the possibility of seeking alternative markets. The Carver brothers would find nothing suspicious about John taking off on a business venture without much notice. It was exactly the kind of impulsive decision their older brother was known for. "Where's John?" Thomas asked as he entered the kitchen, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot. Elizabeth was standing at the stove, stirring the contents of the large pot. The smell of cooking meat filled the kitchen, rich and savory. She'd added onions, herbs, and spices to create a stew that would mask any unfamiliar flavors. "He left before dawn," Elizabeth replied without turning around. "Rode out toward Virginia City. Something about the cattle prices." Robert appeared in the doorway, looking equally worse for wear. "Left without saying anything?" "You know how he gets when he's got business on his mind," Elizabeth said, ladling the stew into bowls. "Said he might be gone a week or more. Something about California buyers." The brothers exchanged glances but seemed to accept the explanation. John's mercurial nature was legendary, and his business dealings often took unexpected turns. They settled at the kitchen table, grateful for hot food and strong coffee to combat their hangovers. "This is good," Thomas said after tasting the stew. "What kind of meat is this?" Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat, but her voice remained steady. "Wild boar," she said. "John brought it back from that hunting trip last month. I've been saving it in the root cellar." "Doesn't taste like boar," Robert observed, taking another spoonful. "I prepared it differently this time," Elizabeth replied. "Used some new spices I got from that traveling merchant. Thought it might improve the flavor." The brothers seemed satisfied with this explanation and continued eating. Elizabeth busied herself with cleaning, fighting to keep her hands steady as she watched John's brothers consume their morning meal with obvious enjoyment. "Did John say when he'd be back?" Thomas asked. "He wasn't sure. Depends on what he finds in California. Could be 2 weeks, could be longer." This news didn't seem to trouble the brothers particularly. John often left them to manage ranch operations while he pursued various business schemes. They were accustomed to his absences and capable of handling the day-to-day work without supervision. Elizabeth served them second helpings, ensuring they ate their fill before clearing the table. She disposed of the leftover stew by claiming she would save it for the evening meal. But in reality, she buried it deep in the desert, where scavengers would make quick work of any evidence. Over the following days, Elizabeth maintained the fiction of John's absence with careful attention to detail. She intercepted the mail, claiming that John had instructed her to handle correspondence while he was away. She deflected questions from neighboring ranches by explaining that John was exploring new business opportunities in California. The deception was made easier by John's own reputation for impulsive business ventures and extended absences. The Nevada Territory in 1878 was a place where men often disappeared for weeks at a time, chasing opportunities or avoiding debts. John's absence, while notable, was not unprecedented. But Elizabeth knew that the deception could not last indefinitely. Eventually, people would begin asking harder questions. Eventually, someone would want to verify John's whereabouts, or would expect him to return from his mysterious California venture. Elizabeth used this time to plan her escape. She began gathering supplies for a long journey, taking small amounts each day to avoid suspicion. She studied John's maps of the territory, identifying routes that would take her away from populated areas and toward the Mexican border. The irony was not lost on her. For 10 years, she had been trapped on the Carver Ranch, isolated and powerless. Now, having committed the ultimate act of rebellion, she was finally free to leave. The question was whether she would be able to get far enough away before someone discovered the truth. Meanwhile, Thomas and Robert continued to manage the ranch operations, apparently unconcerned by their brother's absence. They seemed, if anything, relieved to be free of John's volatile temper and constant criticism. The ranch ran more smoothly without his unpredictable interference. Elizabeth watched them work, these men who had tormented her for so many years, and felt a cold satisfaction. They had no idea that they were living in a house where their brother had died violently. They had no idea that they had consumed his flesh with apparent enjoyment. They had no idea that the meek, worthless woman they had abused for over a decade was capable of such calculated revenge. But Elizabeth knew that her time was running out. She needed to execute the final phase of her plan before suspicion began to grow. And that phase would require one more family meal, one that would ensure the truth of what had happened would haunt the surviving Carver brothers for the rest of their lives. 2 weeks after John's disappearance, Elizabeth began preparing for what she knew would be her final dinner at the Carver Ranch. The date was September 24, 1878, and the autumn air carried the first hints of the harsh winter to come. The seasonal ranch hands had been paid and sent away until spring, leaving only the core family members, Thomas, Robert, their wives Mary and Sarah, and their combined 6 children. Elizabeth had been planning this evening carefully, waiting for the right moment when everyone would be together and relaxed. She'd announced earlier that day that she wanted to prepare a special Sunday dinner to celebrate the successful completion of the fall roundup. The family had gathered in the main dining room, a rare occurrence that John had typically reserved for holidays and special occasions. "This is quite a feast, Elizabeth," Mary said, surveying the elaborate spread that Elizabeth had prepared. The table groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables from the kitchen garden, and even an apple pie made from fruit she'd preserved earlier in the season. "I wanted to do something special," Elizabeth replied, her voice carrying none of the nervous tension she felt inside. "With John away on business, I thought we should take time to appreciate what we have here." Sarah nodded approvingly. "It's been too quiet without John's voice booming through the house. This feels more like a proper family gathering." The children, ranging in age from 4 to 15, chatted excitedly about the unusual bounty. Ranch life typically meant simple meals focused on sustenance rather than flavor. Elizabeth's elaborate dinner was a welcome departure from their usual fare. Thomas carved the roast, a large cut of meat that Elizabeth had prepared with particular care. She'd seasoned it with herbs from her garden and cooked it slowly to ensure tenderness. The meat was dark and rich, with a flavor that was somehow both familiar and unusual. "What kind of meat is this?" Robert asked, taking his second helping. "It's excellent, but I can't quite place it." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression remained serene. "It's from that last hunting trip John took," she said smoothly. "He brought back more game than we could eat fresh, so I've been preserving it. This cut has been aging in the root cellar." "Well, whatever it is, it's delicious," Thomas declared, cutting another piece for himself. John always was a good hunter. The conversation flowed around the table, touching on ranch business, plans for the winter months, and speculation about John's extended absence in California. Elizabeth participated just enough to avoid suspicion, but mostly she sat quietly, watching the Carver family consume their meal with obvious enjoyment. Young James, Thomas's eldest son at 15, was particularly enthusiastic about the roast. "Aunt Elizabeth, this is the best meat I've ever tasted. What's your secret?" Elizabeth smiled at the boy, feeling an unexpected pang of something that might have been guilt. James had always been kind to her, unlike his father and uncle. He didn't deserve to be part of what was happening. None of the children did. "Sometimes the secret is in how long you wait," Elizabeth replied cryptically. "Good things come to those who are patient." As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself studying each face around the table, memorizing details she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. These people had been her family for 10 years, the only family she'd had since leaving Illinois. They had also been her tormentors, her judges, and her jailers. Mary and Sarah, who had initially welcomed her as a sister-in-law, had gradually grown cold as John's treatment of her worsened. They'd never directly participated in the abuse, but they'd never spoken against it either. Their silence had been its own form of cruelty. The children were innocent of their parents' sins, but Elizabeth knew they were learning to treat her with the same casual disrespect they observed in the adults. Already she could see young James beginning to adopt his father's dismissive attitude toward women. The pattern would continue unless something broke it. "Elizabeth," Thomas said, drawing her from her thoughts. "This has been wonderful, but we should probably discuss what happens if John's trip runs longer than expected. Winter's coming, and we'll need to make decisions about supplies and staffing." "Of course," Elizabeth replied, "though I suspect John will be back soon. His business ventures rarely keep him away for more than a month." "Still," Robert interjected, "we should be prepared. Maybe send someone to Virginia City to ask around, see if anyone's heard from him." Elizabeth nodded as if this were a reasonable suggestion, though internally she felt the first stirrings of panic. Any serious investigation into John's whereabouts would quickly reveal that he'd never arrived in Virginia City, let alone continued to California. She was running out of time. "That's wise," she said. "Perhaps after we finish with the dinner cleanup, we could discuss it further." But Elizabeth had no intention of participating in any such discussion. After dinner, she would disappear into the desert night, leaving behind a letter that would explain everything the Carver family needed to know about their final meal together. She'd already written the letter, sealing it in an envelope and placing it where it would be found after her departure. The words had been chosen carefully, calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage while providing enough truth to satisfy any official investigation. As the family continued their meal, laughing and talking around the table, Elizabeth excused herself periodically to check on the kitchen. During these brief absences, she gathered the supplies she'd hidden for her escape: water, dried food, warm clothing, and what little money she'd been able to save over the years. Her horse was saddled and waiting in a grove of mesquite trees a half-mile from the ranch house. She'd moved her supplies there earlier in the day, piece by piece, ensuring that everything was ready for a quick departure. "Elizabeth, you've outdone yourself," Sarah called from the dining room. "This meal is absolutely wonderful. The children are already asking if you'll make it again." "I'm so glad you're enjoying it," Elizabeth called back, securing her traveling pack and checking the contents one final time. Everything was there: food, water, clothes, money, and the small pistol she'd taken from John's gun cabinet. The weapon was loaded and ready, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. Elizabeth returned to the dining room for the final time, accepting compliments on the meal and helping to clear the table. She moved normally, giving no indication that this would be the last time she would ever see these people or this place. "Well," Thomas said, patting his stomach contentedly, "that was certainly worth celebrating. What do you think, everyone? Should we make this a monthly tradition?" The family murmured agreement, already making plans for future gatherings. Elizabeth smiled and nodded, playing her role perfectly, while her mind focused on the journey ahead. As the family settled into the parlor for after-dinner conversation, Elizabeth quietly slipped away to her room. She changed into her traveling clothes, dark, practical garments suitable for a long desert journey. She pinned her hair back tightly and secured her few precious possessions in the hidden pockets she'd sewn into her coat. The envelope containing her confession lay on the kitchen table, propped against the coffee tin, where someone would be sure to find it in the morning. Elizabeth had written it in her careful script, explaining everything from John's years of abuse to the exact contents of tonight's dinner. The surviving family members would know exactly what they had consumed and why. Elizabeth took one last look around the kitchen where she'd spent so much of her life. 10 years of meals prepared at this stove, 10 years of dishes washed at this sink, 10 years of dreams slowly dying in this room. Now it would become the center of a nightmare that would haunt the Carver family forever. She could hear voices from the parlor, relaxed and happy after the excellent dinner. They had no idea that their world was about to change forever. They had no idea that the woman they dismissed as worthless had just served them the most memorable meal of their lives. Elizabeth slipped out the kitchen door and into the desert night, walking quickly toward the grove where her horse waited. Behind her, the Carver Ranch glowed with warm lamplight, looking peaceful and prosperous in the darkness. Soon it would become a place of horror and shame, a name whispered in fearful tones throughout the Nevada territory. As she mounted her horse and turned toward the Mexican border, Elizabeth allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. She had finally shown the Carver family what worthless really looked like. She had finally made them understand the true cost of their cruelty. The desert stretched endlessly before her, vast and unforgiving, but offering the one thing she'd been denied for 10 years: freedom. Elizabeth rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the ranch before dawn would bring discovery of her disappearance. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, bathed in silver moonlight that cast strange shadows among the saguaro cacti and rocky outcroppings. Her horse was strong and sure-footed, having been chosen specifically for this moment months ago. By sunrise on September 25th, she was nearly 25 miles south of the ranch, following old Indian trails that would be difficult for pursuers to track. Elizabeth had studied these routes carefully, knowing that her survival depended on reaching the Mexican border before anyone discovered what she had done. Back at the ranch, the day began normally enough. Thomas and Robert rose with the sun, as was their custom, expecting to find breakfast waiting in the kitchen. Instead, they found an empty stove and no sign of Elizabeth. "Elizabeth," Thomas called, his voice echoing through the silent house. "Where's breakfast?" There was no response. Robert checked Elizabeth's room and found it empty, her bed unslept in. Her traveling clothes were missing from the wardrobe, along with her few personal possessions. "She's gone," Robert announced, returning to the kitchen with a grim expression. "Took her things and left sometime during the night." Thomas scratched his head, more puzzled than concerned. "That's strange. Where would she go? She's got no family, no money to speak of." "Maybe she finally got tired of waiting for John to come back," Robert suggested. "Women get notions sometimes, especially when they're left alone too long." It was Mary who found the letter. She'd come to the kitchen looking for coffee and noticed the envelope propped against the tin. Her name was written on the front in Elizabeth's precise handwriting, along with the words, "To the Carver family." "Thomas, Robert," she called, her voice carrying an odd note of tension. "You need to see this." The brothers gathered around as Mary opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was several pages long, written in Elizabeth's careful script. Thomas, the more literate of the two brothers, took the pages and began to read aloud. "My dear family," he read, then stopped abruptly, his face going pale. "What is it?" Robert demanded. "What does it say?" Thomas's hands were shaking as he continued reading, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "By the time you read this, I will be far from the ranch, never to return. I feel I owe you an explanation for my sudden departure, and for certain events that have transpired in recent weeks." Sarah had joined them now, drawn by the tension in the room. The children remained in the parlor, unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. "John did not go to California," Thomas continued, his voice growing hoarse. "John will never go anywhere again. On the night of September 7th, after years of abuse and degradation at his hands and yours. I killed my husband in this very kitchen." Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Robert grabbed the letter from Thomas's shaking fingers, scanning the words with growing horror. "This can't be. She can't mean—" Robert's voice trailed off as he read further. The letter detailed everything: the beating that had finally pushed Elizabeth beyond endurance, the careful disposal of John's body, the methodical preparation that had followed. But it was the final paragraph that would haunt the surviving family members for the rest of their lives. "The roast you enjoyed so thoroughly at last night's dinner," Robert read in a strangled voice, "was prepared from John's remains. You have consumed your brother, your husband, your father. You told me I was worthless for 10 years. I wanted to show you what worthless truly means. You treated me like an animal, so I treated John like one. May you remember the taste for the rest of your lives. Elizabeth Carver." The letter dropped from Robert's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the kitchen floor like a dead bird. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the ticking of the mantel clock and Mary's sharp, panicked breathing. Then Sarah began to retch. She made it to the sink before her stomach emptied itself violently, the remnants of last night's dinner spattering against the basin. The sound triggered a chain reaction. Mary followed suit, then Robert, their bodies rejecting the knowledge of what they had consumed, even as their minds struggled to process the horror. Thomas stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and revulsion. Of all the brothers, he had been the most vocal in his criticism of Elizabeth, the most creative in his cruelties. Now the full weight of her revenge was settling on him like a physical blow. Young James appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sounds of distress. "Pa, what's wrong? What's happening?" Thomas turned to his son, and James stepped back in alarm at the wild look in his father's eyes. How could he explain this to his children? How could he tell them that they had eaten their uncle, that the woman who had cooked their meals for years had served them human flesh? "Get the children," Thomas said hoarsely to his wife. "Get them out of this house now." "But Thomas, what now?" Thomas roared, his composure finally cracking completely. Mary hurried from the room, gathering the confused children and shepherding them toward the door. Their questions went unanswered as the adults struggled to cope with the magnitude of what they had learned. Robert was the first to regain some semblance of control. "We have to find John's body," he said, his voice hollow. "We have to bury him properly." The search of the ranch buildings began immediately. They started with the root cellar where Elizabeth had indicated she'd hidden the remains. What they found there would provide the final horrifying confirmation of Elizabeth's confession. Wrapped in old quilts and stored like sides of beef, they discovered what was left of John Carver. The body had been systematically butchered with the skill of someone intimately familiar with meat preparation. The missing portions corresponded exactly with what the family had consumed over the previous 2 weeks. Thomas vomited again at the sight, his body convulsing with a combination of physical revulsion and psychological trauma. Robert fared little better, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his brother's remains. "Dear God," Robert whispered, "what kind of monster was she?" But even as he spoke the words, Robert knew the answer. Elizabeth hadn't been born a monster. She'd been created by years of systematic cruelty and abuse. The Carver family had made her into something capable of unspeakable revenge, and now they were reaping what they had sown. The implications of the discovery were staggering. They would have to contact the territorial authorities, report John's murder, and explain how his killer had escaped into the desert. But more immediately, they faced the psychological devastation of knowing what they had done. The children would have to be told something, though perhaps not the full truth. The neighbors would ask questions that would be impossible to answer honestly. The Carver name, once respected throughout the territory, would become associated with horror and shame. But perhaps most crushing of all was the knowledge that Elizabeth's revenge was perfect in its completeness. She had not simply killed John. She had forced his family to participate unwittingly in the desecration of his body. She had made them accomplices in their own degradation. As the sun climbed higher in the Nevada sky, the full scope of Elizabeth's vengeance became clear. She had not just murdered her abusive husband, She had destroyed the entire Carver legacy with surgical precision. The family would never recover from this blow, never escape the knowledge of what they had consumed in their moment of familial celebration. Meanwhile, somewhere in the vast desert, Elizabeth Carver rode toward freedom with the satisfaction of a job completed perfectly. She had shown them what worthless really meant, and they would carry that knowledge with them to their graves. The official investigation into John Carver's disappearance began 3 days later, when Thomas finally worked up the courage to ride to Virginia City and contact the territorial marshal. Deputy Marshal William Thompson was a weathered man in his 50s who had seen enough frontier violence to be surprised by very little. But even he was shaken by what he found at the Carver Ranch. Thompson's official report, filed on October 1, 1878, provides the only surviving legal documentation of the case. The deputy wrote in careful professional language about discovering human remains in the ranch's root cellar, evidence of systematic butchering, and a written confession from the suspected perpetrator. What he did not include in his official report was his personal observation that the surviving family members appeared to be suffering from severe psychological trauma beyond what would be expected from simply discovering a murder. "They can't eat," Thompson wrote in a private letter to his wife. "Any of them. They've lost weight something terrible in just a few days since it happened. The women can barely speak, and the men jump at shadows. It's like they've seen something that broke their minds." The manhunt for Elizabeth Carver was extensive but ultimately futile. Tracking parties followed her trail for nearly 100 miles south before losing it in the rocky terrain near the Mexican border. The consensus among the searchers was that Elizabeth had either died in the desert or successfully crossed into Mexico, where territorial law could not reach her. Local newspapers covered the story with varying degrees of sensationalism. The Nevada Weekly Herald ran a headline reading, "Rancher's wife murders husband, flees to Mexico," but provided few details about the specific nature of Elizabeth's revenge. The more salacious details were considered too disturbing for publication and were shared only in whispered conversations in saloons and general stores. The Carver family never recovered from the trauma. Thomas sold the ranch for a fraction of its value 6 months later, using the money to relocate his family to Idaho. Robert followed suit, moving his wife and children to Oregon. Neither brother ever spoke publicly about what had happened, and both families changed their surnames within a year of leaving Nevada. The ranch itself stood empty for several years before being purchased by a cattle company from Colorado. The new owners tore down the original buildings and constructed new ones, but local superstition ensured that the property never again housed a family. It remained a commercial operation staffed by seasonal workers who were not told about the land's history. Elizabeth Carver was never seen again in the Nevada territory. Various sightings were reported over the years. A woman matching her description working as a seamstress in Carson City, another running a boarding house in Elko, but none were ever confirmed. The official conclusion was that she had died in the desert during her flight, though her body was never found. However, there exists one tantalizing piece of evidence that suggests Elizabeth may have survived her escape. In 1891, 13 years after the murders, a package arrived at the Virginia City post office addressed to "The People of Nevada Territory." Inside was a daguerreotype photograph of a middle-aged woman standing in front of what appeared to be a small house or shop. On the back, written in a familiar hand, were the words, "Some things are worth the wait, EC." The photograph was turned over to territorial authorities, but by then, the case was considered closed, and the surviving Carver family members had long since disappeared into anonymity. The image was filed away and eventually lost, leaving only a brief mention in the postal records to suggest that Elizabeth Carver might have lived to see the new century. The psychological impact of Elizabeth's revenge extended far beyond the immediate family. Word of what had happened spread throughout the territory, despite efforts to suppress the details, creating a cautionary tale that influenced how frontier families treated their women. Several documented cases exist of abusive husbands being confronted by neighbors or local authorities with warnings about ending up like John Carver. The case also had a lasting impact on territorial law enforcement. New protocols were established for investigating domestic violence, and several jurisdictions began appointing women as informal advocates for wives in troubled marriages. While these changes came too late to help Elizabeth, they represented a recognition that the existing system had failed catastrophically. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a researcher at the University of Nevada who studied frontier domestic violence in the 1960s, wrote extensively about the Carver case. In her 1969 book, Hidden Violence: Women and the Western Frontier, she argued that Elizabeth's extreme response was the inevitable result of a system that provided no legal recourse for abused women. Elizabeth Carver was not born evil, Dr. Mitchell wrote. She was created by a society that valued cattle more than women, that considered wives property rather than people. Her revenge was horrific, but it was also perfectly calculated to exploit the deepest fears and taboos of the culture that had brutalized her. The ranch property changed hands several more times over the decades, eventually becoming part of a larger development as Reno expanded into the surrounding desert. Today, the location where the Carver Ranch once stood is occupied by a shopping center, its tragic history unknown to the thousands of people who pass through daily. But in the archives of the Nevada Historical Society, carefully preserved in acid-free folders, the original documents from the case remain available to researchers. Deputy Marshal Thompson's reports, the few surviving newspaper accounts, and even a copy of Elizabeth's confession letter provide a window into one of the most disturbing crimes in territorial history. The letter itself makes for chilling reading even today, more than 140 years after it was written. Elizabeth's precise handwriting and calm tone create a stark contrast with the horrific acts she describes. Her final words, in particular, continue to resonate with anyone who reads them. I spent 10 years learning what it meant to be worthless in the eyes of those who claimed to love me. I wanted to teach them the same lesson, to show them how it feels to discover that something they valued was actually worthless all along. They valued their family bonds, their shared meals, their masculine pride. I made all of those things worthless with a single dinner. Now they know how I felt every day for 10 years. The Carver case remains unique in the annals of American crime, not just for its shocking nature, but for the methodical way Elizabeth planned and executed her revenge. Unlike crimes of passion or desperation, Elizabeth's actions showed a level of premeditation and psychological sophistication that was almost unprecedented for the time period. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the perfect symmetry of Elizabeth's revenge. She had been treated as less than human for 10 years, so she literally reduced her husband to meat. She had been told she was worthless, so she made the family's most precious bonds, their shared meals and family gatherings, worthless through contamination. She had been powerless, so she claimed the ultimate power over life and death. This mystery shows us that even in the harsh frontier environment of 1878, where violence was common and justice often rough, some acts were so calculated and cruel that they transcended ordinary understanding of right and wrong. Elizabeth Carver's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the human capacity for both cruelty and retribution. What a haunting tale from the Nevada frontier. Did Elizabeth's years of suffering justify her unimaginable revenge, or did she cross a line that no amount of pain can excuse? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Your city or state adds to the story's reach. If this chilling slice of history left you wanting more, give this video a thumbs up, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, and hit that subscribe button for more tales of the wild frontier. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows of the past with us.